So nice to be here with everybody. My background, transactional attorney, but my focus is really in the art world. I was at Christie's for a little bit less than 10 years, first as a lawyer, then running the commercial office, and then started up the art finance group, and also a private banker. But my network is primarily in the art world.
Hey everyone, I'm Noah Solowiejczyk. I'm a partner at Fenwick West in the white collar and investigations practice. And before I joined Fenwick West, I was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York for about 10 years. And I did sort of a variety of matters relating to white collar criminal issues, but one of the roles that I held at SDNY was as chief of the illicit finance and money laundering unit and the asset forfeiture coordinator. And in that role, I dealt with a number of cases that touched on the art world and forfeiture of looted art, fraud by people in the art market. And we're going to, I think, cover some of these topics today. So that's sort of my how I've intersected with the art market in the past. And now at Fenwick West, I help companies and individuals think through compliance issues around anti-money laundering and sanctions, including when it comes to art. Wendy, did you want to start by kind of just talking a little bit about what the market is like right now, the current state of things, which is, sort of, it's an interesting time in the art market?
Absolutely. I mean, the art market's changed a lot over the last 20-ish years. The way that I like to think about it is when you go back to the global financial crisis and the world really stopped and nobody knew what to do, the market changed pretty rapidly with respect to more tangible assets like art. So prior to 2007, 2008, you were really dealing with people who were wealthy people who put their money into various collecting categories, but they didn't really treat art as an asset class. Then after the global financial crisis, people really did not know where to put their money. They weren't really comfortable putting it into real estate or financial instruments. And so they started to pour it into art, art collectibles, watches, wine, jewelry, pretty much anything that was tangible because people really didn't know what was going to happen in the world. And that kind of led to the way that I'd view it is a lot of Wall Street guys started to pour their money into post-war and contemporary art, which kind of pulled away the natural previous trend, which was Impressionist and modern, and kind of brought it more into, buying Warhol's, Basquiat, Keith Haring, things that were sort of deemed to be more street art. And that's where the market really ballooned over the next 5 to 6 years, primarily in New York. That's where the buying base really was. And then around 2013 to maybe 2016, the market really exploded in China. And it was a lot of people who were interested in pulling their money out of mainland China, and they were pulling it into post-war and contemporary, but also classical Chinese art. And then after that, the market kind of cooled a little bit with COVID, and the market is back in New York, but it has really slowed down quite a bit. A lot of the people who were buying in 2008 to 2020 are no longer really huge collectors. You kind of have that next generation that's stepping in. And those people are not really buying at those levels that are the 20 to 50 to $100 million per piece. They're really more focused on the modern contemporary, but things that are a little bit less expensive, which has really skewed the way that the auction houses have had to deal with things. And the gallery world has changed a bit as well, but still seems relatively robust. But the auction results have diminished quite significantly over the last 3 to 4 years.
So Wendy, it is interesting what's been happening in the market. And I know something you and I we're talking about and preparing for this is sort of this generational shift that we're going to see, and what that may look like. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now or
Yeah,
later, but
yeah, I'll touch upon that now. And that's really the question mark that the market has at this point is if you have this baby boomer collecting generation where they built massive, massive collections in a number of notable families, is what's going to happen when that property ultimately is sold. And I can say from my experience, 99% of the time, the kids do not want the art. They want the proceeds of sale from the art. So then you have the question of if that really does come to auction, which is my world, but it also could be going through dealers and a variety of other channels, is what do you do to find that next buying base who's going to absorb that material that will ultimately be offered for sale? And that's the real question mark that everybody in the market has right now, is what is the depth of the market? Are you really going to be relying on that next generation of collectors to absorb that material? Or are you going to be looking at institutions, corporate collections, museums, places where they might want those Monets or Degas or Renoirs that the kids don't ultimately want? So that's kind of the rub right now, is who is this next generation of buyers really going to be? And will there be a diminution in value for those sorts of artists? And also for the really big ticket items, people who 10 years ago were spending $200 million for a painting. Is there really somebody out there who's going to want to spend that kind of money on those items? And that's what people are really kind of struggling with right now. But people seem to be focused on more contemporary art, and some of the classical things, but there's a lot of worry out there in the marketplace.
Makes sense. Wendy, one of the things that I've found, and my experience is, sort of colored and jaded by my role as a federal prosecutor, and I sort of intersected with a lot of these issues when things had gone sideways, and people had been defrauded. But, one of the things I've always found interesting about the art market is, there's sort of this extensive level of trust, in transactions that are high value transactions, potentially tens of millions of dollars of value at sometimes. And I personally have seen how that can go horribly wrong. But I don't know, I can in a minute talk about some examples of that. But did you just want to set the table of what do these transactions often look like, and who are, there's a lot of folks in the market that are art advisors, agents. Who are these folks? What is their role?
It's a really strange market, because unlike just about every other market in the world, the art market is almost entirely unregulated. So you can have any number of people who will claim to be an art advisor, and they'll effectively put up their own shingle and say that they have expertise in a certain area, but they've never passed any exams, they've never gone through any necessarily formal training. It can just be somebody right off the street who sets up an art advisory at a Gmail address, and then they go out and they attempt to bring in clients and advise them on transactions. They may not really know how to advise them. They may not know the right kind of art to recommend to this person. But then when it really gets down to the transaction is where things can get really murky, because they probably don't know how to write a contract. They probably are not fabulous negotiators. And I kind of carve out those who are truly art advisors from these others where they've just stepped their toe into the waters of the art market because they think it's an interesting place to make money. But they don't really understand the nuance. They also don't know the players in the art market. And there are, probably 5,000 or 6,000 of us out there who know something about the art market and also know most of the people who are involved. And with one or two phone calls can really determine if somebody's a legitimate person in this space or not. So you've got some concerns around the expertise that these people have, but then there's also, some ethical things too. Are these people signing contracts with clients and actually disclosing how they're making their money? And oftentimes these art advisors will double dip. So they'll basically be charging a fee for the person who is the collector when they do a transaction, but then they're also sometimes getting paid by a dealer who's presenting the property to them, which is where a lot of issues in the last several years have really come out in the open. And no, I know you've dealt with some of these situations, and they've certainly been in the papers, and it's really sullied the overall art market quite a bit when you've got big names who do things that are not necessarily contractually agreed or even ethical.
Yep. Yeah, and so, my experience at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I supervised the prosecution of Lisa Schiff, which got a lot of attention in the press at the time in the art market. Um, and she was a pretty well-respected figure, is my understanding, Wendy, before this all happened.
Yes.
She ran her own art advisory called Schiff Fine Art. And just to be, everything I'm going to talk about is stuff that's in the public record, just to be clear. So I'm not airing any, private law enforcement information in this and just giving you guys an overview of this. But I do think it's a cautionary tale for folks that are thinking about transacting in valuable art, because this can easily, you can become the victim of one of these frauds relatively easily, even if you're a sophisticated person, a sophisticated player. Um, and I think, part of what that case was about is how these art advisors, a lot of their clients really come to trust them, and don't necessarily demand the type of oversight that you might typically demand with a professional advisor. So, just by way of example, one of the things she did over and over again that she pled guilty to was essentially someone would, she basically had full control over the flow of the money and the flow of the art, which is a recipe for bad things to happen. So, if a client was buying art, thought they were buying art, the payments were routed through her business, through accounts that she controlled, and then supposedly were going to be passed on to the seller. You could think of a world in which, if you wanted to be more risk averse, and even if you trust your advisor, you say, well, look, it's better to have controls around these things. The money could be parked in escrow, the way it often is in lots of other types of transactions, high value transactions. And then similarly, she often had custody or control of the art, which led to the potential for her to say, that art had been sold, that she basically say that art was not sold, that really was sold, and pocketing the money. And she did this, I think 55 times in total is what she pled guilty to, is about $6 million loss amount, which is a lot of money. That could, in the art world, that's not the king's ransom, but it's a significant sum. I think it's just a case that's sort of a cautionary tale. If you're going to be transacting in the art market and using these types of advisors, you may want to, or your clients are, you may want to think about what are the controls I want to put in place to make sure that the advisor is not in a position where they could steal either the funds or, actually just divert the art itself.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think a lot of this can be resolved if you've got a signed contract that's very clear with the advisor. And in my experience, I've seen advisors who will, in some respect, try to shame a potential client and say, it's not necessary, you can trust me. And even though we're dealing with some pretty sophisticated business people who are art collectors, they can get intimidated in a world that seems different than the worlds that they are king of the universe in. And especially in the art world, where it's a very clubby environment and you want to be invited in to have those buying opportunities at galleries, or you are interested in being the first one at the art fair who's able to purchase a piece it's very important. It's a delicate balance to have those conversations, but also to be very firm that you need to have clear understanding of who's representing whom. And Noah, as you and I've talked about, there was another case of Inigo Philbrick, who was double selling certain paintings. So he would acquire a painting, but then he would sell that painting to one person and then later sell it to another person, but nobody ever had physical control of it. He ultimately ended up fleeing, I think, to Vanuatu, and was eventually arrested there, and was serving time in prison. He's now out, and miraculously, he is now yet again an art dealer, an art advisor, and trying to drum up business. And that just kind of shows that even when you go down, there's this sort of phoenix opportunity to come back, because the art world can be a pretty forgiving place, but it's also a dangerous place if you don't have clear expectations on who's doing what.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So Philbrick was also my office prosecuted him. And I also think I read either he's coming out with a book or he came out with a book already, or so, you know, and I'm sure people will buy it. You know, it's an interesting story if nothing else.
Absolutely.
So anyway, you know, those are sort of I view that as this is your worst case scenario. You know, you could and to your point, Wendy, there's the clubbiness, there's the intimidation, then there's also a lot of times close personal friendships that develop between the advisor and their client. You know, they're going around looking at art. It's very easy. You can imagine how you become very close with this person, and then that blurs the lines. And sophisticated business people who in any other transaction might say, what are you, crazy? Like, of course, I'm not going to just put the money in your bank account. I'm going to put it in an escrow account. I'm going to need this. Like that all goes out the window somehow when you're talking about art. It's interesting, and it's a very unique type of transaction.
Yeah, I think so. And I think too that when people start to treat art truly as an asset class, that's where, you know, the lines can kind of get blurred even more. And especially in the last 15, 20 years, when art's really deemed to be that asset and not just something that's a beautiful hobby or passion to have, you also see some issues when it comes to things like art finance. Um, and that's something that is relatively new in the last 15, 20 years. It's really kind of ramped up where people who have collections are able to borrow against those collections. And they can typically do it in three different ways. They can borrow from traditional private banks, but the bank is going to be doing a full underwriting of that client. They're not going to be doing purely asset-backed lending. You can borrow from an auction house. Sotheby's has the biggest loan book from the various auction houses out there, very robust program. And then you can also borrow from boutique lenders, which oftentimes will do purely asset-backed lending. So regardless of what somebody's financial situation looks like, you can still borrow against that Picasso that you have on your wall. Obviously, when you do that, you're going to be paying a lot more in interest because it's a much riskier endeavor. But people have really started to use this as opportunities to take what's on their walls and leverage it and then put it into their businesses. But as Noah and I were talking about the other day, there was a situation relatively recently. In fact, I think the decision came out end of July with a borrower who double pledged, and that Noah certainly is an issue.
No, that's a real issue, and yeah, this got a lot of attention a couple weeks ago. So this involved Phil Falcone, who used to be the founder of a major hedge fund called Harbinger Capital, and you know, sort of had a bit of a public downfall that included a major $18 million settlement with the SEC for misusing customer funds, market manipulation, this other violations. But when he was starting to get into financial trouble, he had actually entered into a $92 million loan that was secured by four you know, pieces of very valuable art. And then, you know, I think as things became more desperate, he then double pledged that art to another lender. I'm not sure as sophisticated a lender. And he also took some steps to conceal the fact that there had been this double pledging by using like a shell entity essentially to make it harder for the second lender to understand that actually there were already liens against the works that he was putting up. And there was a decision out of the New York Supreme Court that essentially said you know, that there was fraudulent inducement with these loans because he had pledged the artwork twice, and now I think he's on the hook for a lot of money.
Yeah, and it's just sort of a cautionary tale that the people who, and because there's so much more private lending these days, just generally in every market, that people who, you know, perhaps a family office who'd like to put their capital to work, that understanding the art market a bit if they decide to lend in that space is really, really important, because people will not necessarily be candid if they are in a desperate situation like Falcone was. And sort of outside of the arts finance space, a lot of other kind of financial people are starting to look at other ways to invest in art, or to be not just the collecting side, but also, perhaps setting up art funds. And there are two basic ways that people kind of think about art funds. An art fund can be an entity who is acquiring the art. It could be, a number of different pieces. They've got a hold period for those pieces, and then they'll ultimately put them back onto the market when they think that there's been a sufficient appreciation. And then the people who've invested in the art fund will get a return. But obviously it's a liquid market. So if you invest in an art fund, you've got to be prepared to have a longer time horizon than perhaps on other more liquid investments. That's sort of what a traditional art fund would be. And there's another way also to do investing in this manner where you're not acquiring an entire piece. And that would be in fractional art investing. And, a lot of friends that I know and a variety of other people have been very curious about this area. And there are a few different firms who do this. Masterworks is one that you all may have come across. And essentially what they do is they will fractionalize a piece of art that they acquire, so that you as an investor, hypothetically could buy 1% of a Warhol. And then they would have a hold period for it. They would ultimately sell it, and hopefully you would get a return on that investment. But it's important to really, if you have an interest in these areas, to really understand what the hold period is, what the opportunity is, if you're really investing in a true art fund, or if you're investing in a fractionalization of a painting, and asking those important questions. Because you have a lot of people who I think are intrigued by the idea of investing in art, but they don't want to take the whole risk of acquiring an individual piece. And being able to get involved in something that's a little bit more unique is there are a lot of questions around it, but there also could be an interesting opportunity. And I think that's where you're seeing the art market really change and become a much more financialized market. 30 or 40 years ago, you never would have heard about any of these products. So my view is, again, you sort of go back to the global financial crisis. You get a bunch of Wall Street guys who get involved then in the tangible assets, in the art market in particular, and then they always like to create new products from that. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing these days.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I think kind of also tied into this too is really, if you're acquiring art, is being smart about the planning around the asset class. And the planning is, it's interesting coming at it from a private banking perspective. I've seen that a lot of advisors do not want to talk about the assets that they don't truly understand that their clients own. They're very comfortable talking about equities and bonds and real estate and things that are sort of more traditionally in their wheelhouse. But when it comes to the more esoteric assets like art, it's something that they really don't talk about. And I've had clients historically where, their wealth may be $100 million in securities, but then they've got a $2 billion art collection that their advisor has never spoken with them about. And that's a real problem, because planning around art is something that can be very problematic when the art goes into the estate after the decedent has passed away. So having those conversations before there's a need to do selling, I think is critically important. And then also looking at it from a tax perspective, because capital gains on art is enormous. If you're a New York resident and you bought well and you want to sell during your lifetime, you're looking at a tax bill that's going to be over 45% on that capital gain. So if you can be wise about managing that collection from a planning perspective and a tax perspective, it can save a family a huge amount of headache when they really don't want to deal with it. And one example that I'll give that I dealt with when I was at Christie's is a client had a nice collection. She decided to gift all of it but two pieces to a major museum. And in her will, she gifted one piece, which was a Renoir, to her daughter. At the time, that she did her will, which was in 1989, it was worth about $800,000. She gifted a Warhol to her son, which at the time was worth a little bit less than $1 million. And she died in 2013. The kids never want the art. I can say categorically, they never want the art. And the parents never want to believe that, but it's 100% true. The daughter decided to sell the art. It sold at auction later in 2013 for, I believe it was about $900,000. The son decided to sell the following year, the Warhol, and it sold for $63.5 million. And because there was not planning or discussion around what the true intention was of the woman who passed away, it ended up completely fracturing the family. The siblings never spoke again. The son did not give his sister any of the proceeds of sale, even though the idea was to give something of equivalent value. And it was something that could have been avoided if there had just been some basic planning around it, which is unfortunate.
Fortunate.
And then one of the other
Right.
things, Noah, that you and I were talking about are some of the legal issues around art, which I know you are very familiar with. And if I can just jump in first on the title issue, but then
Yeah.
sort of let you take it on. So title is a real issue in the art world. There is no Department of Motor Vehicles. There is no yacht registry. There's nothing that actually tracks ownership. So if somebody owns a piece, the only proof that they have, or at least evidence that they have that they own it, is an invoice, and perhaps they've been insuring it for a long period of time. But those are typically the only indicators that they actually own it. There's no definitive database, which can cause all sorts of issues as the art is sold and transferred to people down the road. So just something for people to be aware of, that there oftentimes is a question about who actually owns what.
Yeah. And to that point, so you will often hear about the topic of provenance. And it's, as Wendy said, there is no DMV or, property registry. And oftentimes there can be very convoluted provenance histories for certain pieces. And a risk that's out there, if you're going to buy a major piece of art and really invest in it, is you probably do want to understand the provenance of what it is that you may be buying, because if you don't, and don't do the diligence around that, it can come back to really bite you when you try to sell the piece or otherwise. And I'll give you a couple of examples about that. And one of the things that my old office, the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Manhattan, did a lot of work on was returning looted cultural artifacts, but I'm not going to talk about those. But that's like there was a whole 60 Minutes piece last year about some of the Cambodian cultural artifacts that my old office was involved in that were being shown at the Metropolitan Museum. But then also looted Nazi art that was looted by the Nazis. And I'll just kind of walk you through what that could look like, just to give you a flavor for it. And how, if you're the person who's trying to go sell your art at a major auction house, how, that might not be the most pleasant experience if you find out that actually turns out the Nazis looted the art that you're selling. So basic legal, I won't get too in the weeds on the basic legal principles, but there's something under the law called forfeiture, which basically, means that you can forfeit the property that was involved in a criminal offense. In many cases, you're outside of this world, you're actually seeking criminal forfeiture, which is that you get a conviction against somebody. Like a typical case would be you get a fraud conviction against somebody, and then you're also going to forfeit their proceeds from the crime at the time of sentencing. But when it comes to the art world, and you're really talking more about what's known as civil forfeiture, it's actually a civil proceeding where you have the United States bringing a case, will be captioned as United States versus put in your famous piece of art. That's the defendant. It's a property action. It's an in rem proceeding. And what the case is really about is this art the proceeds of a criminal offense? Even if the people that engage in the criminal offense, they're not in the courtroom, they might be dead. A lot of times they are dead when we're talking about the situation of looted Nazi art. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still a remedy. And civil forfeiture kind of is the path that the U.S. government will go down to try to restore this art to the rightful heirs, family members who the art was taken from. So I'll go through one real world example. And Wendy, we didn't talk about this, but maybe you may know this one because I think maybe your old employer was involved, which is a scholar sharpening his quill by Solomon Koenig. And this is sort of a famous one that my office was involved in my old office was involved a few years ago. But this was a painting by Solomon Koenig, who was like a contemporary of Rembrandt, the Dutch painter. And that painting, it was sort of known that painting had been looted. It was looted from a very well-known collection belonging to a collector of Adolf Schloss, called the Schloss Collection. It's very famous in the art world. And he was a famous art collector in Paris before World War II. And he had died before World War II, but his heirs, his 4 children, still had the collection. It was a well-known, famous collection. At the outbreak of World War II, the family kind of had a feeling that this was an art collection that was really going to be at risk, and they tried to move the pieces to a chateau in southern France, essentially in the hopes that they wouldn't be found. There's like tons of books that are fascinating about this, but there was a whole, sort of Nazi group that actually was dedicated to locating art and taking it back for the Nazi regime. That was called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. It was the Einsatz Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was run by this guy, Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the chief architects of this effort. And they located this collection. They actually knew about it. They were looking for it. They found it in southern France eventually, and they moved all the paintings back to Hitler's headquarters that he maintained in Munich. So this was sort of a known historical fact that this had all happened. There've been a couple of cases about it over the years. And because the Nazi regime documented everything, they actually documented most of the stuff they looted, which is actually very helpful in these cases because you have sort of very granular documentation about where they took stuff, where they put it, what they did with it, where it was displayed. So now I'm going to fast forward to November of 2017. A Chilean art dealer brings a piece to one of the 2 famous auction houses in New York to put it on auction. And this is a common fact pattern. The auction houses, and Wendy will speak to how I think they've gotten much more robust in the process they undertake before they put a piece up for auction. But they undertook an investigation into the provenance of the piece, and they began to question. There were some unexplained things they couldn't figure out in the file, and they started to worry. Even though the piece was being sold under a different name, they started to worry that it was actually this other piece, a scholar sharpening his quill, and it was pretty well known in the art world that had been looted by the Nazis. And they reached out to the seller to say, we need more information, we have a lot of questions. This is from the public record, but I think the seller was really not happy and revealed, well, my father bought this. It's bona fide. He bought it from an art dealer named Walter Andres Hofer in Munich. Well, that was actually a really bad fact because it turns out Hofer was well known. He was Hermann Göring's chief purchasing agent during the Nazi looting campaign. So like saying this was essentially like almost like an admission, like, oh yeah, actually we got it from Hermann Göring's chief purchasing agent. That's the trail for where this painting came. And I think this is the most common fact pattern, at least when the federal government gets involved. Once the auction houses think there's an issue, they do frequently contact the FBI. The FBI has an art crime team. And the auction houses, they can't just give the art to the FBI and to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They have contractual obligations. If and Wendy can maybe speak to some of this, but they have to, they can't just hand the art over. Do you want to talk about that before?
Yeah, it's a delicate situation because you've entered into a consignment agreement with the seller of the art who doesn't really have good, clean title because of the issues that Noah just described. So then you have to contact the person who's trying to sell it through the auction house and say, hey, we've got an issue here with provenance. And there's a pretty bad cloud around title. So we can step into the shoes and help you negotiate with the rightful family who had this art stolen from them or where it was a forced sale. And those negotiations can be pretty protracted and emotional. Usually the way that it works out, if everybody's a reasonable person, is that the person who tried to sell it at the auction house and the rightful claimants will typically split the proceeds in a negotiated fashion. And it could be a 50-50, it could be a 60-40, whatever can be negotiated is what ultimately will clean the title, and then it can actually be sold. But that can be a years-long process. And the auction houses usually have a few people who focus exclusively on staff on these sorts of issues. But it's a tough negotiation. But if you don't have that cloud removed, you basically have property that's almost effectively worthless. There are a few countries in the world who do not necessarily recognize these Nazi issues, but then you've really limited who your buying pool is. So most people like to negotiate it out.
So, so negotiating it out, sort of the way Wendy described, is definitely a path that happens. The other path, sometimes the consignor initially is resistant and doesn't want to negotiate, or there's other circumstances that sort of lead the auction house to decide they need to contact the FBI. And what the government has to do at that point is they have to establish probable cause through a seizure warrant that this piece actually is the proceeds of various potential federal criminal offenses, which could include, among other things, transporting stolen or looted property interstate. There's a few different potential statutory hooks for how the government can make that probable cause showing. Then they go before a judge and actually swear out, the FBI agent will swear out an affidavit in support of a seizure warrant. In my old job, I used to review those. And then, they basically can come and they can give that to the auction house and say, okay, the auction house now has the legal process that it needs to say, well, yeah, sure, we have this contract, but we've got compulsory legal process. We have to hand this over to law enforcement at this point. Oftentimes, once that happens, whoever's involved in this, not surprisingly, who's the consignor, gets pretty freaked out and says, okay, I want to find a way to negotiate this. And I do not want to deal with, fighting the U.S. government in a forfeiture proceeding. But that doesn't always happen. And sometimes, you do have well-resourced folks that for whatever reason, and there can be different reasons, it can be personal or matters that really feel that they had no red flags that they could have possibly been aware of, that, they will try to challenge the U.S. government. And then it would go to an actual civil forfeiture proceeding, where, a lot of times one of the key issues will be, was there anything, there's a defense known as a bona fide purchaser for value defense. And a lot of times the issue in those cases will be, was there really not anything that red flags out there that should have given you cause to believe the property could have been stolen? But more often than not, folks, once they realize the U.S. government's really has made a probable cause showing and is serious about this, they will then negotiate with the U.S. government and the heirs. And a lot of times you'll have almost like a tripartite negotiation that ends with the consignor saying, I'm going to give this back to the heirs. I recognize, even though, I'm not admitting any wrongdoing, I think that's where it belongs. That's the proper place for this art. And there've been many, over the years, ceremonies that have been held by the U.S. Attorney's Office where they essentially have a return ceremony where the heirs come, and sometimes it's hosted at different places, meaningful places. And that's a way that the art actually can get back to the heirs through U.S. government intervention. But it all starts with the auction house's provenance research. But
It does, and I think it's an important thing, is to have people who really understand what the history is of the period between 33 and 45, and the names, as you mentioned, of the primary dealers who were trading on behalf of the Nazis and who were funneling art to them. And so you kind of have those handful, if not, 20, 30 names of suspicious transactions. And once you have that in the provenance, you'd really need to dig deeper. There are also other cases, and one of the auction houses had this issue a few years ago, where they had a big jewelry collection that was slated to be sold in Europe. And the way in which the woman's family had made the money for her to be able to acquire the jewelry was to fund Nazis. And so it was basically the proceeds of those businesses then led her to be able to purchase this pretty massive jewelry collection. And ultimately, the bad PR around it forced the auction house to cancel the sale, because it was just from a public relations perspective, not worth the amount of commission that the auction house would have earned.
so, speaking of publicity, the other big topic in this area that if you talk to folks who are lawyers, it's particularly in the defense bar who deal with art issues, is the Manhattan DA's office. And I don't have a lot of time, but I'll just say there've been in the Manhattan DA's office, the way they go about seizing what they allege to be looted art or looted cultural artifacts is very different than the process I just described. It does not involve them making a probable cause showing to a judge. It's been the methods they've used in recent years have been criticized by a lot of lawyers as sort of lacking adequate process. And a couple of museums have actually decided to try to litigate against the DA's office, specifically the Chicago Museum of Art and the Cleveland Museum. And both cases now, the last time I spoke about this was not the case, but it's now the case. Both museums ended up, one settled and the other one lost in court, ultimately, and got a lot of bad publicity along the way. So it's kind of, even though people have issue with the methods the DA's office has been using, most of the time, folks don't contest it for various reasons, but one of them being the potential for bad publicity.
Makes sense. And there's also, more recently, I think there's been some real focus, Noah, that you and I've been talking about on it. Although the art market is really not regulated, there's been interest in the government, the Senate in particular, really focusing on anti-money laundering issues. From my time working at an auction house years and years ago, there were very few checks that happened on really the know your client side of the business. If somebody was purchasing or consigning through an LLC, there was very little digging into who the underlying beneficiary is or was of that LLC. And I think what we're seeing is, 5 years ago, the UK came out with some pretty clear know your client checks to make sure that there was not money laundering happening on a very regular basis in the art market. And the Senate seems to be very interested in really codifying something similar as well.
Yes. So in recent years, you've definitely seen more scrutiny of the art market as a potential vehicle for money laundering and sanctions evasion. And I think this new draft legislation, which was just released a couple of weeks ago, it's being proposed on a bipartisan basis, is sort of in furtherance and in recognition of that. But even a few years ago, the U.S. Treasury Department came out with a pretty significant report advising folks in the market about certain practices that they should be considering undertaking, but then also, sort of highlighting how art can be used for large-scale money laundering. And there have been some prominent cases in recent years. You know, you had there was a Hezbollah financier who was using art to launder over $100 million on behalf of Hezbollah. That's sort of a very extreme example. And then also when it comes to the Russian oligarch class, in addition to sort of been a lot of news reporting around their use of shell companies to buy, you know, high-end real estate in Manhattan, but they also often will buy, you know, millions upon millions of dollars of art under the names of shell companies. And that's done, you know, sometimes just for money laundering, but a lot of times it's also a sanctions evasion scheme, because you may have folks that this is being done on behalf of who have been sanctioned by the U.S. government. So this is a significant issue. The proposed legislation, which, you know, it's just early days and these things take a long time to wind their way through the legislative process, but it would actually put significant, you know, portion of the art market under the Bank Secrecy Act, which is, you know, what regulates anti-money laundering in the United States. And it comes, the Bank Secrecy Act, I mean, I do a lot of work around the Bank Secrecy Act for folks in fintech, in crypto, in banking. It's, you know, very significant obligations. I mean, companies have whole departments that handle their BSA, their Bank Secrecy Act compliance. So this is proposing that dealers, collectors, galleries, auction houses, advisors are all gonna potentially have certain obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act to know your customer and make sure that, you know, you're not having transactions done for the purpose of money laundering. With that said, there's some exemptions that the draft legislation has. So artists who sell their own works would be exempted. Businesses or individuals that haven't made a single sale of more than $10,000 or transactions totaling over $50,000 in the previous year would also be exempted. So they're trying to exempt sort of smaller players in the market from this law. I think this is just sort of a recognition that this is a market that is getting more scrutiny. And I think, you know, whether or not this law passes, it just kind of shows that if the law passes, certainly there would be folks in the space would need to, and Wendy, you'll talk about this in a second. You know, in theory, it's going to change how everybody in the space is doing business and is going to make them have to really think more carefully about compliance. But I think, Wendy, you have some personal experience about at least how certain of the players are already behaving, even though there isn't a law on the books.
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with the global auction houses and also the mega galleries, they've really already been doing most of what it looks like the Senate wants them to do, based on when the UK passed the law in 2020, just because it didn't make sense for them to have different ways of treating clients based on different locations. They just had sort of a blanket view on adopting what the UK legislation was. So I think it's not really going to impact them too much, but it will be impacting some of the smaller players that are more locally based, just in the States. And there's going to be, you know, quite a bit of additional expense. And what I'm seeing are new companies that are cropping up that will be basically serving as outsourced places to do this kind of work, so that if you've got a gallery that maybe has, you know, less than 10 people who are working in the gallery, you don't want to have those people not focused on sales. You want to be able to have an outsourced resource who is bonded and insured, who would be doing this kind of work. So I think we'll probably see more of that happening. And hopefully not the galleries or dealers having to have their own internal person, because that just is not a great use of their business strategy. And then, Noah, one of the other things you and I were also talking about is just, where do we see the future of the market? And, you know, your experience in blockchain and like the financial world, I think the blockchain is perhaps something that you've got some views on as well.
Yeah, and I think you know, oftentimes my firm, Fenwick West, is a sort of tech. We've worked for a lot of tech companies, including blockchain Web3 companies, and sometimes there's some question and criticism around what are the use cases for blockchain. I actually think art is a pretty good use case because if you really actually had ownership of art on the blockchain in a visible way, a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today in theory would be, greatly diminished. You might actually really have an audit trail as to where art, who had passed between. The other thing it potentially opens up is the democratization of art ownership. And, in theory, and I think you are starting to see some of this, but it hasn't really come online fully. You could, have fractionalized ownership, but you could also have sort of a free trading market of tokens where that each represent some very small fraction of ownership of a particular piece of art. And then you could even have a secondary market where those trade in crypto. So there's a lot of potential. I think it hasn't fully been realized yet. And there definitely are players in the space that are like really trying to exploit these opportunities at the moment.
Yeah, and I think also just tying into that, one of the other interesting areas which I think would be great for artists is that when you're dealing with a blockchain, there's also potentially an opportunity to have the artists who create the work, the contemporary artists, or even their foundations, as the art transfers ownership over time, to be able to perhaps build in a contract where there's a resale payment that would go back to that original artist, because it's painful, I think, for everybody in the art world to see an artist where they are fabulously talented. They have a relationship with a gallery. The gallery is earning hypothetically 50% of whatever that piece of property sells for, which is perfectly reasonable because they're the marketers of that artist. But then when it gets flipped into auction 5 or 10 or 20 years later, and it's selling at 100x, that original artist doesn't get to share in that appreciation. And the blockchain may be able to build in a component that would then give the artist back a portion of that appreciation, which I think everybody would think is, reasonable and fair, and also is also, perhaps something that accelerates even more creativity if those artists believe that they will be getting future revenue as well. So I think